profession will look increasingly different from what it looked like when I left law school. One of my personal great learnings has been working in different markets and jurisdictions and regions is just, you can have essentially the same codified legal or policy concepts in a piece of legislation or a guideline, a government policy, but how it is lived and breathed in a particular market can be completely different.
The way we approach the cultural piece of it is also, and culture ties so much to language, but how business is done in different parts of the world can vary a fair bit as well. So what I appreciate from people that have been in your shoes, that have worked in those different regions, is that you can bring that varied perspective. Lisa, thank you for joining me on Firing on All Cylinders, or as we call it, Firing on All Syllables. And I was looking forward to having you on the podcast, and it's a great opportunity to get together. And I know it's your morning being on Australia, so appreciate that even more.
My pleasure. It's great to see you, Gary.
So, Lisa, we've had guests on the podcast that come from all walks of life and different experiences, but they've seldom come from sort of having a lot of Asia Pacific experience, having worked in Australia, having worked in the Middle East, having worked out of Singapore, etc. So take us a little bit, and I'm going to take you all the way back to who Lisa is sort of growing up, where you were born and raised, and a little bit of that background, and then just the highlights of your career journey, just for the audience that doesn't know you, so they can get to know you a little bit more.
Sure. Happy to give you that background. So Australian, as you can hear and tell, grew up in Australia, and I never actually thought I was going to be a lawyer, to be honest with you. I was always a fairly sort of like sciencey type of student and kid, and always loved that. But I think I enjoy sort of left brain and right brain activities. And that was kind of what brought me to the law. But since a young age, like as a student, I had the opportunity to live in Denmark for a while. And that gave me a lot of wanderlust, actually, which set me off on that sort of international career. So even though I'm an Australian, I spent the majority of my career overseas, working in different parts of the world as a lawyer. And I have a real passion for that cross-cultural engagement and frankly, cross-cultural application of concepts and ideas. And I've worked in 3 different organizations as a general counsel or an in-house counsel in quite different industry sectors. So I did about 9 years in Colgate-Palmolive, working for them on 4 different continents around the world multiple times. I worked at PayPal for about 5 years, so financial services and tech. And then I worked at Mars for about 3.5 years, so back to consumer goods and food, which is actually very heavily regulated. But at the moment, I'm in Australia and I'm working in an insurtech startup and sort of creating a very digitized, AI-driven legal risk and compliance function for that organization as they scale. So I think most lawyers who are listening to your podcast would agree there's never a dull moment when you're a lawyer. There's always something interesting to turn your skills or intellectual curiosity to. And so that's how I've approached my career, and that's what makes me tick.
That's that keeps a lot of lawyers motivated, Lisa. That change is constant. It's all about how to stay on top of it effectively.
That's right. Yeah.
So, Lisa, growing up, who do you think had the biggest influence on you? And this can be a family member, could be somebody, sort of friend, family, business mentor. It can be open on the options.
Yeah. Look, I think growing up, like I was very close to my grandparents in particular. And so I think from a relationship viewpoint, that grandparent-grandchild relationship was really, really special to me when I look back and reflect on that. And so much joy and love came from that. In terms of understanding the world and growing up and coming to terms with the opportunities and challenges that come with adulthood, I think some of the educators that I was lucky enough to be exposed to, actually, I'm sure this probably resonates with a lot of people, but you cannot underestimate the impact that a really good teacher can have on a student at a critical moment in time, right? So I remember having a particularly wonderful maths teacher. I remember having a particularly wonderful chemistry teacher, and just the inspiration that comes from that without even realizing that you're open to it. can be just quite incredible and really impactful for a very long time.
And Lisa, the I'm pivoting to something else because a lot of the listeners are going to wonder, and just as a recap, the you've lived from just me going off of memory, Sydney, Singapore, Dubai, New York, Chicago. I may have even missed some cities in between. I think in Europe at one point. So as well.
And then in Denmark.
Prague, that's what it was.
Yep. Yes.
What was that like? If you were to say what was your favorite city, what was the favorite experience?
Mm.
Sort of employer aside, because this is no judgment on the employer, but rather like the just the experience of having been in those places.
Yeah, look, I mean, I have loved everywhere that I've had the privilege and pleasure of living, actually, which I know is a really kind it sounds like a really weak excuse. But I think when I say that, like everywhere I've been lucky enough to be has had something wonderful about it that I and my family, when they've been with me, have really enjoyed. And I think just being open to sort of getting to know a place, not as a tourist, but as a resident, is a very special experience and process. And I think and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this because you've obviously moved around too. But I feel like you sort of get the highest of the highs in terms of some of those experiences, but you also can get some of the lowest of the lows in terms of some of the challenges, right? Like I literally worked for a company that made this is a funny story, like laundry detergent. And I moved to Prague, and this was like 15 years ago. And the very first time I went to a grocery store to get some provisions for the house, I had to buy some laundry detergent. And I bought bleach because nothing was labeled in English. And I had to try and figure out what I thought was laundry detergent. And it's not like I didn't know that product. And I got home and I opened the cap on the bottle, and just this like really intense smell of bleach came out. And I was like, oh my God, I bought bleach instead of laundry detergent. So you have all the like those little moments as well, which are just little setbacks. But yeah, it's a really funny mix. But I love that culture shock, that cultural I don't provocation, I guess, in some ways, like because you're the outsider or the foreigner, you're responsible for figuring out how to exist somewhere. And I love that process. I love the unpicking of that the more time you spend somewhere.
And did it help give you perspective, Lisa, on and just generally speaking around how you address problems from a professional perspective?
Think so. I think so. One of my sort of personal great learnings has been working in different markets and jurisdictions and regions is just, you can have essentially the same codified legal or policy concepts in a piece of legislation or a guideline, a government policy, but how it is lived and breathed in a particular market can be completely different, like the enforcement approach. And that there's all these cultural pieces, whether we realize it or not, that sit around how legal judgment and legal assessment and legal analysis is made. And that's pretty fascinating. And I think that happens in many disciplines. And I think an example of that we can probably all relate to is what happened during COVID a few years ago. I mean, it was kind of crazy how different countries had such different approaches to managing that, right? Even though we all had essentially the same scientific information, one would argue, to base those actions on.
And it's because I know you asked me what I thought about it as well, Lisa, and I think it really helps perspective. Like if you only lived in North America or in Australia for that matter, and you dealt with an immigrant that came from anywhere else in the world, it's hard to put yourself in their shoes
Yeah.
until you've been sort of in the situation you were in Prague, and you're like, oh, that's what that feels like, and it
Yeah.
really gives you perspective when you're actually in the business world, because that could be your colleagues, that could be people, that could be sort of business partners you're working with, whatever that may be. But that
Yeah.
perspective is the interaction, understanding how people approach things and where they came from.
Yes. I think that's a good word for it, perspective. And it's a much broader aperture, isn't it? And there's probably a piece around empathy that you can sort of develop your sense of empathy a bit more as well. I don't know about you, but this comes back to firing on all syllables, literally.
Yeah, that's right.
Do you sort of get a sense of how like if you take the English language, which is sort of the international language, how even it gets used in different places is, I found that utterly fascinating too. I mean, in some ways, one of the more challenging in terms of adapting experiences I had was when I first moved to New York, because everybody speaks my native language, but they use it in such a different way that I found myself sort of doing reverse gymnastics in my head in terms of thinking about, well, this is what I would say. Is that what somebody would take away from? And then, like probably really overanalyzing that. But it's interesting.
Well, and I think that's part of the perspective, Lisa. The other part I find is that the way we approach the cultural piece of it is also, and culture ties so much to language, but how business is done in different parts of the world can vary a fair bit as well. So what
Yeah.
I appreciate from people that have been in your shoes, that have worked in those different regions, is that you can bring that varied perspective. And then it's a lot easier to do international business for any
Yeah.
organization, because you're like, okay, I can work with this region a lot better now because I
Yeah.
understand culturally. If I'm going to the Middle East, I'm not necessarily going on one trip and waiting to get a bunch of contracts signed, because they may want to develop a relationship a bit more before there's sort of an agreement. Or Brazil, for that matter. The idea is that, understanding the different parts of the world will operate a little differently, and that brings a different nuance to the doing business in those regions.
It does. It does. And Gary, like, do you think that, 'cause one of the things I think about just with, the technological evolution that we're going through at the moment and the increasing sort of use of tools and the ubiquity of some of those tools, or the increasing ubiquity of them, does that sort of dampen or diminish some of the cultural aspects ultimately to how business is done? Or does it just add more complexity to that cultural diversity in terms of how business is done in different regions?
So, and as you can appreciate, I've had sort of lengthy discussions around this for the very reason of the industry that I'm in. So the way I like to describe it is the situation you were in Prague, where you kind of had to wonder, what is this product? Now that's resolved, where you could take a picture and quickly find out, here's what this is, and get that
Yeah.
live translation in a way that does make life easier.
Yeah.
But it by no means is going to make you communicate much better with that Czech person, because you could sure dictate something and something that says it, and you could probably get some basics through, but you're not going to be able to bond with them unless you've made the effort of actually understanding that language yourself and really connecting with them, even if it's a very basic level. Because
Yeah.
people appreciate the effort and what you've done, sort of learning a little bit of their language very differently than, okay, here I'm using a tool to communicate that just about anyone else can.
Yeah.
So it's differentiate between facilitation and, okay, I'm getting from point A to point B to, I'm investing in this relationship by learning a little bit and speaking to you in your language, albeit any mistakes I may make in speaking to you.
Yeah. 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 So facilitation is one thing, but true connection is something that can't be done. Yeah. Yeah. That makes
That's right.
sense.
And true connection is not going to be replaced by technology, because, the very nature of human nature is that we, think of our evolution, right? That we had to come across people and wonder, are they going to kill us and take our food, or can there be some level of trust here? And that is ingrained in our genetics. You're not going to replace it with just good tech. Certainly not in a short time frame. Maybe we get there from an evolutionary perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. I know. It's kind of like a fast track and a slow track, and yeah, the intersection of that.
So, Lisa, I'm pivoting a little bit. So, you've worked for a variety of large organizations. And for the purpose of the audience, when I met Lisa, she was at Mars Wrigley. We were at a in-house council gala in Chicago, and sort of was a great discussion. But Lisa is also very much a futurist, appreciates the rationale for good operations in legal, good tech, the reason for thinking out of the box in terms of how we approach the legal marketplace. So, Lisa, now I'm going to be a bit futuristic with you and say, how do you expect the future of law to be different 5 years from now, considering sort of the what's available and how things are evolving? What does
Yeah.
that look like 5 years from now?
So I so I'm going to give you a very unsatisfying answer up front. I'm going to say I don't know. And if I had a crystal ball, that would be great. But I mean, there are a few trends or themes that I think a lot about, that give us some clues as to what that, very midterm type sort of view of the legal world might look like. Firstly, I think you can't forget that law is one of the key pillars of achieving a civilized society. So it's not going to go away. Like, we are going to still need lawyers and really good thinkers. And so I don't worry excessively. I mean, I think the profile of the legal profession will look increasingly different from what it looked like when I left law school. I won't tell you how many years ago, but I think that just bedrock of humanity doesn't go away. So we're always, I think, going to need lawyers, and in some ways more sophisticated thinkers than ever before, although, obviously some of the best and brightest minds become lawyers and work in the legal sphere in society, and I don't see that changing. I think the biggest trend or the biggest impact is around access to legal knowledge, legal information, and what do we do with that? What do lawyers do with that? What do non-lawyers do with that? When do you like, if you're a non-lawyer, when do you actually interact with a lawyer versus a piece of technology in a couple of years' time? And I think that's the stuff that's the kind of concept that lawyers can get concerned about, or, you see a lot of commentary around that. Like, that's a train that has left the station and we can't stop that. And I don't think we want to stop that either. Like, a lot of good can come from a much more democratized availability of legal information and legal knowledge. It's not this opaque domain of a privileged few. I think that can serve us very well to have increased and more accessible, affordable access to legal skills and legal knowledge in a society. I think that you potentially get generally a more sophisticated society as a result too, because of that access. But I also think that we possibly end up with, and we're already seeing this, right? And you see it in the HR and talent world as well. Like, content generation becomes this very easy thing. So if you want to dispute something or write a letter, or like, you kind of put in one or two prompts and you hit a button and that's good enough and send it off. So just this sheer scale of legal matters is probably going to increase a lot in certain respects too. But I'm really excited about this democratization and availability of legal knowledge. And then I think the question comes to, well, what are the guardrails that are going to sit around that? And I do think as lawyers, we have a role to play in supporting that responsibly and not trying to stop the train that's already left the station. I mean, if you work in a company today, I think it's a little delusional or not realistic to think that people are not looking up their legal questions on a chat GPT or a Claude or
No, I think
like,
that makes sense.
yeah. Yeah. So I think there's a long way to go. And for Bet the Company Matters, you'll still be sort of, going to the rocket scientists or the neurosurgeons and paying them thousands of dollars an hour to guide you. But absent that, I think there's a lot of efficiency and access to be gained, which is a really good and exciting thing.
When Lisa, and I love the disclaimer at the beginning where you said this is not going to be a very satisfying answer. In typical legal fashion, you had to throw the disclaimer at the beginning. So, but I think that makes a lot of sense. I think you described very well what that future will look like. And there's no doubt that lawyers will be needed. I think there's a lot of room for improvement and sort of areas where technology and process, et cetera, can do a lot to help. But
Yeah.
it is, holistically speaking, there's still the judgment and the experience of lawyers, and it doesn't even have to be the bet the farm, so to speak, but it can, there's going to be a lot of situations when you're building a shareholder agreement, for example, and a lawyer that says, hey, I've seen these scenarios, I know you, maybe these are some scenarios that you should consider putting into it, that Whereas ChatGPT, or no judgment on any tool, but any tool will give you enumerate some issues to be aware of. That nuance of being able to put it in your context will be really driven by a professional that says, and it also will push professionals as the result to not be generic and just be like, okay, well, here's, put this check boxes, because then tech will be able to do that. It'll make professionals better because they'll
Yeah.
be more accountable to add value.
I think that's right. I think that for lawyers, there's a opportunity to really augment the level at which we are exercising our judgment. And that to me is very exciting. But I'm a lawyer who's worked for a couple of decades. I don't know what that feels like if you're coming out of law school now. I mean, you're probably going to learn faster than we learned, which I think is wonderful. I mean, we only know our own journeys, but you're right. Like, I think, I can see how I can really start to build now on my sort of experience and exercise judgment across broader domains, or I'm being invited to exercise judgment across broader domains, like, in relation to data and data governance and, oversight of operating models in organizations, or, being asked to think about when we need human override mechanisms, or when you need the human in the loop in terms of some of the AI tools we use in our business, and how do you have accountability in those different operating models and so forth. So definitely being asked to exercise judgment in what for me is a mental model that didn't exist in the first part of my career.
Now, we talked a little bit about what the future is likely to look like. If I
Mm,
was the managing partner of a law firm or
mm.
the of a GC of a larger organization, much like some of the roles you've had in the past, what advice would you give me to prepare for that future?
So I think we do have the underlying skills, but my advice would be to think in terms of like the fundamentals that drive the demand that always exists for legal support. So think about risk mapping, which is something that we do. And then think about how that informs how you sort of build legal risk management into an organization. Whereas I think the very century 1.0 version of our world is for us, and I'm being a little bit too black and white here, but just to try and make the point, for us to sort of sit in our ivory towers and people to come to us and ask for us to provide an opinion on something. Like, I don't know if you remember, but like, and these things still get issued, but you do a piece, you do a transaction or something, and you'd get this like very formal legal opinion that would come out at the end of which kind of blesses, that the finance transaction or what it is, and everything sits on that, everything rests on that. Whereas I think the better approach today, given the world we live in and the capabilities that we have access to and are cultivating, is to be at the design phase and to be sort of infusing that legal insight, and like the content of that legal opinion from the get-go. And so you might still get that piece of paper digitally at the end of the day, but it's not a sort of a ta-da type moment,
For sure.
because you've been there the whole way through. So thinking about what those tools are, how you use them, and what the business is and what the business objectives are. Again, that's a fundamental that hasn't changed. But your ability to have legal insight and add value in terms of setting things up in a company, whether it's, a particular workflow or it's contracting practices or something, such that some of the risks that we've had to help companies get out of when things go wrong never occur in the first place.
That's right.
Yeah. So very architectural, I would say, and integrated, very, very integrated cross-functionally across an organization.
And Lisa, one of the biggest challenges that I find with lawyers, technology and process side, even without being futuristic, is not
Yeah.
necessarily knowing how to add value very well to in-house counsel.
Yes.
So most of your career has been in-house. What advice would you have for lawyers in private practice in terms of how to add value just generally? And then you could get more specific if you'd like on considering how technology is evolving now as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a few domains that you can think about external counsel support for in-house teams. There's that overflow piece where, in-house teams just never have enough resources. And sometimes, things just do get too extreme and you've got to ship some work outside. maybe there's less of that now and less of that in the future, but I do think it's a phenomenon that's never quite going to go away. So I think really setting yourself up to be that resource, and that's kind of relationship driven as much as anything else. So that connection piece, which can lead to some of that just, transactional facilitation type piece. I do think there's a real value add there that GCs can really value, and that's traditional. But it's, when you're in a moment of need, it's fantastic. And then, look, I think the other thing is no one knows your business or the business you're working in as well as you do from an in-house external counsel viewpoint. But what GCs don't have enough time to do, or certainly I don't, that is super valuable from external counsel is tell me what you're seeing in terms of horizon scanning across an industry or across a body of law. Because I don't have time, or I don't necessarily have that perspective. And those insights can be phenomenally valuable to me as I'm helping to architect or horizon scan in terms of proactively helping an organization appropriately calibrate its risks in accordance with its risk appetite. And so I think, sometimes external counsel will try and demonstrate their depth of knowledge in a particular industry or on a particular business side, and that's fine. But my advice would be, it's fine to stick to your knitting. That's what you're there for. That's what you're really good at. But you see things that I don't see, and identify those and share those with me. And I truly, truly value that.
Add value well beyond the specific questions being asked, be
Yeah,
proactive, sharing those learnings that
yeah,
potentially can cover blind spots you were not even thinking of, extremely invaluable.
exactly. Yeah, exactly, exactly. And synthesizing things too, because we're all very time poor. If you think about it through a time poor lens, you're gonna come up with some good value propositions, I have no doubt.
Well, I mean, to your point, lawyers by nature will give you, you ask a simple question, they'll give you a 10-page memo, and all you want to say is, I just need to know
Yeah,
really simply. So give me a paragraph with the answer, and then if you want to put a bunch of disclaimers afterwards, that's fine. But
yeah.
give me the answer. If it needs to be a couple options, give me two or three and highlight the one that you recommend, and
And tell
that's
me
it.
why.
Simple,
Yeah.
right?
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. On memos, it is a little bit of a bugbear of mine, although now you can sort of just ask an LLM to give you a TLDR on it. So that's okay. But
But it's silly that they couldn't do that, right? Like, you have to go to a third-party tool to have to do that.
yeah, exactly, which is really unfortunate. But I think, I've always kind of lived by the iPhone principle, and it sounds a bit glib, but it's like if I can't read it, and I do have a big iPhone, like not the little one, but the big one. Like if I can't read it on a screen, then don't necessarily bother writing it. Like I understand you might need to write it to clarify your very important, rigorous thought process. I get that, and that's important, but that's not necessarily helpful to me. So if I can't read it on an iPhone screen, book a time, let's have a conversation, and then I'll tell you what type of memo, if any, I actually need.
That's great advice. Great advice. When in doubt, give some color, take the person through, and at least be practical. Like, yeah, this may be easier over a quick chat. Can I take you through it? Versus,
That's right.
let me give you this memo, bill you for all that time, and then try to figure out, oh, that's not quite what you needed.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I do think, everybody always forever has talked about billing and what happens with billing. I think that will become increasingly difficult in terms of time-based billing for legal work. And I welcome it, like I know general counsels are always some of the least adventurous when it comes to taking off alternative fee arrangements and so forth. But I think it's fair to look at the value of outputs and not inputs when it comes to pricing legal work. And I really look forward to more of that.
But I think there's a general hope in the marketplace that we all get towards a value add versus strictly billing time, which has been sort of disliked, certainly by the in-house community. But I feel like even some lawyers probably don't feel comfortable doing that.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's right. I think that's right. But, I mean, one of the great capabilities with generative AI technology is prediction, of course, right? And so now everybody has a tool at their fingertips. Maybe it's not perfect, but it's pretty powerful to provide insight into what a piece of work will cost or how you might actually think about pricing that from a predictive range. And so why are we not using that more? Some people are, but yeah,
But not enough.
I don't know.
So, Lisa, we'll move to a portion of our podcast that I call the rapid fire questions. And for
Mm,
this, it's sort of think of one word answers. The first thing that comes to mind is supposed to be very simple. And then once we wrap this up, I'll come to you with one last question and I'll let you know in advance. Essentially, any last piece of advice that you have, whether for sort of legal community more generally or any legal executives listening, but potentially even any business people that could benefit from it, that you're like, I wish Gary had asked me this because I really wanted to speak about that. So I'll
okay.
come back to you with that. But how
Yeah.
many languages do you speak?
I speak, depends on how well. So that's not one word, is
Ah,
it?
get by.
I get by. I'm going to say 4.
Okay, now I want to know what they are.
Oh, it's not. Okay. Well, now I have to give you a few more words. English, of course.
Well,
French.
4 was your answer. Now this is me asking for more information.
Okay. 4. English, French, Danish, Cantonese.
Okay. I know you went to Albania last summer. Clearly, you didn't pick up enough Albanian to get by.
I did not. I did not. I'll have to go back. I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
What word do you hate, if any?
I'm going to give you a childish answer to that one. Slime. It's
Nothing wrong with that,
not a nice word.
but that's why you hate it.
Yeah.
What word do you have a hard time pronouncing, if any?
Yeah. I'm going to try and say onomatopoeia.
Okay, that'll be hard for anybody. Can't
Okay,
blame you for
good.
that. What is your favorite word in any language?
For me, that's really easy. My favorite word is hygge, which I don't know if you know that word. It's
I
developed a
don't.
bit. It's gone a bit viral in recent years. So it's a Danish word, but it's very similar, I think, in a couple of the Scandinavian languages. And it can be a verb, hygge, or it's an adjective, hyggelig. And it just is a very hard to translate. That's your domain, not mine, but like cozy, warm, very good feeling inside. So I'm
I
I'm
love
gonna
that.
go and hoot myself. I'm gonna go and have a nice, cozy, warm time. It's a really hard to translate, but super sweet word.
I'm going to do that after this podcast.
Great.
So,
Yes.
what is one word to describe yourself by? And that's the last question.
Yeah. All right. Well, look, the first word that came to my head, so I'm going to stay true to the exercise here. It's not necessarily very flattering, but the word that came to mind for me today was scattered, which I think is just a reflection, just how many plates I'm sort of spinning in the air at once, and trying to be across lots of different things. So I definitely feel scattered.
Well, and it's, I think that's the nature. I saw a Mondac report that came out recently where it's basically sort of a large survey of in-house counsel saying there's, it's clearly less resources and they're expected to do more. So
Yeah.
scattered becomes inevitable just by the definition, having to balance all these things.
Yeah. That's right.
And you're just living the definition.
Exactly. Me and probably every other GC out there, really.
And Lisa, I promise I'll come back to you with one last opportunity to say, what was, if there was one piece of advice or anything that you wish I had asked you to leave with the audience today.
Yeah. Well, I think actually talking about feeling scattered is probably not a bad thing, because I think that it's in our sort of, fast paced, sort of very consumable world. It's very easy to think others are on top of things, I'm not. And I think that is a very like deluded mindset to have. I think we all are dealing with tremendous amounts of acceleration and ambiguity and sort of challenge to be learning new technologies, which is just so different from anything we've used before. And so just recognizing that and giving yourself the space and grace to be able to sit with that is something that we probably don't hear enough from people. And I just think it is so important to our well-being. So that is a point that I would love to just share and underscore with everyone. Lots of excitement, lots of amazing stuff, but don't lose the essence of yourself as you're engaging with it.
So important, Lisa, figuring out ways to maintain that essence and to make sure it doesn't get lost in the world that we're scattered and where every real algorithm is competing for every ounce of our attention at any given
That's
moment.
right. That's right. Exactly. So many bright, shiny new things.
Lisa, had, as always, lots more to ask you, and we would be here much longer if I continue down the path that I was over. But I appreciate the time today. It's been fantastic having you on the podcast.
Thanks, Gary. It's been really lovely to see you and have a chance to catch up. And I hope we get to speak again soon.
So